All right, I'm here with the chair of the United States Humanist Party, Michael Felly, and today we're going to talk about the middle class and what just happened to America.
What just happened to America? Yes, I like that. Did you come up with that?
I wish I could claim that, but no.
All right. What just happened to America? Before we go into the specifics, you have to actually define what is the middle class. So one thing of note that is important to understand is that the middle class isn't struggling because rich people are getting richer. The middle class isn't struggling because poor people aren't working, they're getting unemployment, and or they're getting welfare checks. The middle class is struggling despite the fact that rich people are getting richer. The middle class is struggling despite the fact that the poor are on welfare and unemployed. So even if, a hypothetical, even if all poor people suddenly took a job at Burger King, McDonald's, Wendy's, Walmart, Target, if they all got employed, guess what? The middle class would still be struggling. So they're struggling despite the fact that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting welfare. So why is the middle class struggling? So you have to actually begin with defining what is the middle class. Now this may come as a surprise to anybody listening to this video. There is no definition of the middle class. The government does not have a definition of the middle class. The Democrat Party does not have a definition of the middle class. The Republican Party does not have a definition of the middle class. Now, there is a middle class definition that people use. It comes from the Pew Research Center. And most people use this definition, but it's not an official definition. It's an arbitrary definition. And what the Pew Research Center says is you're looking at 2/3 of the income to 2 times the median income, which amounts to, for a family of 4, $47,000 to $141,000. And most people say, okay, we accept this as the definition of the middle class. But we could change it. Overnight, I could change the definition to include, okay, let's go down to 20,000 to 200,000. And just like that, I've doubled the middle class. So it's an arbitrary definition. So when we speak of the middle class, why is this important? This is a question that most people don't ask. Why is it important for America to have a middle class? Because when they wrote the Constitution of the United States, the importance of the middle class was woven into the Constitution of the United States. So the Constitution of the United States is a middle class constitution because it was mostly based on James Harrington's written work of Oceana, where the middle people were vital to the stability of the republic. That's why many parliaments may have classes being represented in their governments. You have poor people being represented, middle people being represented, and rich people being represented in a parliament. We chose to write a constitution based on a republic. So the middle people would be the stability of the republic between the poor and the wealthy. America has always had wealthy people, but it would be the middle people that would be the check on the encroachment of rich people. So even though we have separation of government, which we do, we have the House of Representatives, we have the Senate, which is Congress, we have the presidency, we have the Supreme Court, and we have the Federal Reserve, which is not necessarily written into the Constitution, but it is a vital aspect of America. So separations of power doesn't work if one group hijacks all the powers of government. And that's what you're seeing with the 1% of the 1% of the wealthy today, is that they're hijacking all the branches of government. So you no longer have checks and balances. You don't have one branch checking the other branch, and the ambitions of individuals, which what James Madison referred to as factions, keeping in check all the other branches. So we have the 1% of the 1% hijacking the United States government. Now what this means is they are using their interests at the expense of the middle class. That's what's happening to the middle class. So as we've had 4 economic models in the United States in our short history. The first economic model was the Gilded Age, which lasted roughly between 1860 and 1900. Between 1900 to 1940, roughly, we had what was called the Progressive Era. Then we had from 1940 to 1980, we referred to as the World War II generation model. And today we have, from 1980 to today, what's known as neoliberalism, based on the theories of Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan. We humanists refer to this as plutocracy, capitalism. And we've moved from the invisible hand of the World War II generation to the xenomorph, that alien creature from the movie Alien, that xenomorph. That now is the invisible hand from baby boomer neoliberalism. So it's latched itself onto the face of millennials and Generation Z, and it's inseminating millennials with these over-the-counter derivatives. And moving forward, as one generation will enter retirement and eventually die, which happens to everybody, millennials and Generation Z don't have a choice because they're inheriting their model. And just like the movie Alien, if you try to remove this, what happens? It bleeds acid, and, you don't dare kill it because it will kill everything around you. So eventually what you're seeing is the hearts of millennials and Generation Z are going to be ripped open, just like you see from this movie Alien. So, we no longer have the invisible hand. It's actually a xenomorph moving forward. So James Harrington was very influential for our forefathers in writing the Constitution of the United States. So what I'm going to pull up here right now is what you're looking at on our website is the Pew Research Center's aggregate income of the United States. This is what you're seeing. So in 1970, aggregate income of the United States for the middle class was 62%. Today, it's around 40%. Now, in 1970, we always had rich people, and they amounted to about 30% of the population. Today, that rose to almost 50%. Now, what we're also seeing is if you look at the average age of generations, and if you look at the average age at 34, when baby boomers were the average age of 34, that occurred in 1989. In 1989, they had 21% of the wealth in the United States, that generation. My generation, Generation X, we turned the average age of 34 in 2004, and my generation had only 6% of the American wealth. And your generation, millennials, turned the average age of 34 last year, 2020, and you only have 3% of the wealth in the United States. So we went from 21%, 6% to 3%. So you can see how this is a crisis of the middle class.
It's quite the drop.
Yes, it is. So there's a MIT professor, retired professor emeritus, Peter Temin, wrote a book called The Vanishing Middle Class. And I encourage anybody listening to this video to Google Peter Temin, The Vanishing Middle Class. You will enjoy this book. What he did is he took a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Sir Arthur Lewis. Mm-hmm. He won a Nobel Prize in economics for a model looking at developing countries. And Peter Temin plugged in today's data in the United States into this economic model by Sir Arthur Lewis to see what he would find. And what he found was America has moved from a developed nation, roughly around 1970, to a developing nation today. In other words, what he found is we've regressed instead of progressed.
Right.
Which is quite fascinating in and of itself. So in the 1970s, the United States was a country of production. Today, the United States is a country of consumption. In 1970, America was the world's foremost creditor nation. Today, America is the most indebted nation. And what Peter Temin also found was for 20% of Americans, things are very good. And who are these 20% people? Well, they're the STEM people, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and also the finance people. Mm-hmm. So for those 20%, things are good. But for the other 80%, the low-wage workers, were struggling. So Peter Temin in the book shows where we came from and where we are today. My critique of this book is he didn't go into actual detail as to what happened, like how did we get from point A to point B. So we humanists, to explain how we got from point A to point B, is your question, what just happened to America? So we have the American dream, right? And
right.
Even Donald Trump, whether you like him or dislike him, talked about the American dream being dead. But I don't think Donald Trump actually mentioned what the American dream is. This country has always had poor people. We've always had immigrants. We've always had rich people. Our forefathers were very wealthy people. They were rich people. The American dream is rooted in the idea that if you're born poor, which the majority of people are, that with hard work, doing the right thing, getting an education, etc., you will have class mobility.
Right.
Be able to rise up. And if you use your head wisely, you could go from a poor person to a very wealthy person. If you understand the system and do things properly. I think it was Hawthorne that said, families are always rising and falling in the United States. Nathaniel Hawthorne. So that's the American dream. So Donald Trump is correct. I wouldn't say the American dream is dead, but I would say it's on life support. It's in the ICU. It's in critical care. So basically, your question was, what just happened to America? Well, the xenomorph of baby boomer neoliberalism happened to America. So now I'm going to pull up on our website what just happened to America. Wages. Wages. Mm-hmm. So what you're looking at now on our website is a very famous graph by the Economic Policy Institute. And if you notice in the graph as you're looking at this, hourly compensation used to follow productivity in the United States very closely. And then all of a sudden, it split. So you don't have to be a scientist to ask yourself, well, what happened there when it split? Well, that split happened roughly about 1971. Well, one significant thing that happened in 1971 is we removed ourselves from the gold standard officially. Started in 1933 under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but it was officially severed in 1971. So you can see that hourly compensation has stagnated as United States productivity has gone up. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, worker productivity has increased roughly 70% between 1980 and 2020, but hourly pay has only gone up about 12%. Now, as you go from 1970 until today, you are going to see rising prices. What could a dollar buy in 1970 versus what a dollar could buy today? So Andrew Bosselmworth from PIMCO, Germany said it best. Gradual inflation, in this sense rising prices, has a numbing effect. It impoverishes the lower and middle class, but they don't notice. So what this is a play off of the proverb, the frog and boiling water. If you have a frog in water and you very slowly increase the temperature of the water so the frog doesn't notice, he will eventually boil to death. If you have a frog in water and you turn it up immediately, he'll jump right out. So this is the numbing effect of rising prices. So what your generation is witnessing is over the years, the value of the dollar has come down. Mm-hmm. That's the devaluation of the US dollar. Wages have been stagnated, and over time things have gradually increased. You don't really notice it, you don't feel it, but you notice it because you're struggling. That's why the middle class is struggling with wages. So now going back to the website, you asked me what just happened to America. I have to add one thing here. Okay. For those of you at home, you're going to love this. The median wage of a full-time worker is more than 3% below what it was 40 years ago in 1980.
That's crazy.
Still, exactly, still 3% below. And I have this on my website. And I also want to add this also before we go on to jobs. Between 1989 and 2016, so roughly 40 years, the median net worth of households in the middle 20% of income rose a measly 4% in inflation-adjusted terms to roughly $82,000. For households in the top 20% during that same time period, median net worth more than doubled to over $800,000. For households in the top 1%, the increase was a staggering 178% to over $11 million in this 40-year period. So as I said before, the middle class is struggling despite the fact rich people are getting richer. Mm-hmm. In fact, this xenomorph from baby boomer neoliberalism benefits the 1% of the 1% at the expense of the middle class. That's what you're seeing in the United States of America. So now moving on to jobs. You have to understand that jobs weren't stolen. Jobs were given away. And this started back around 1980. And it started with what's known as the corporate raider. Who were the corporate raiders? Well, there's two famous movies of the corporate raider. You have Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street that Oliver Stone did. And you have Edward Lewis from Pretty Woman, one of my favorite movies. These are corporate raiders. They come in to corporations, they chop them up, they ship off all the jobs, they sell off the land, build condominiums or whatever on the land. Now, I mentioned fictional corporate raiders, but in real life, and I have this on my website, is T-Bone Pickens, Carl Icahn, Ronald Perlman, and junk bond maven Michael Milken. And what was their creed? Greed and short-termism. were their creeds. That's all they cared about. And what this amounted to goes back to Milton Friedman's, when he was asked about the social responsibility of corporations, he kind of, social responsibility. The social responsibility of corporations is to maximize profits. That's what these corporate raiders were all about, maximizing profits. For who? Shareholders. Mm-hmm. Shareholder democracy. That's what is going on in the United States today. In essence, that creed, that manifesto of Milton Friedman is rather sociopathic in nature, because when you're only looking at the maximizing of profits above all things, that's sociopathic. So this is where jobs went to begin with. Then we have in the 80s, what happened in the 80s? We had the rise of Japan. I remember growing up, the way people speak of China today, everybody was speaking about Japan in the 80s. Japan was going to purchase the entire world until their economy collapsed in 1989. So we sent most of our manufacturing jobs for tools and automobiles to Japan. We started there. To get away and break the backs of unions in the United States, trade unions in the United States. So they could go to Japan. They had this great plan called organizational integration, where they put the usually like a master's degree individual on the plant floors, and they were producing better cars than what we could in the United States. Then in 1989, we had the fall of the Soviet Union. And this opened up an entire Eastern Bloc in Europe, as well as Russia. Right. So in 1973, we had over 1 million textile workers in the United States, 1973. In 2016, we had just a little over 100,000. We lost close to half of all manufacturing jobs between 1980 and 2015. And shareholder democracy was the driving force behind that. Now, today, most people talk about NAFTA and China. So again, on our website, I'll give you a couple of statistics.
Okay.
NAFTA actually started under Ronald Reagan, was signed into law with Bill Clinton. But it started under Reagan, President Bush, and then President Clinton, the first President Bush. Mm-hmm. So NAFTA coincided with a 30% drop in manufacturing jobs from roughly 18 million at the end of 1993, which is when NAFTA really kicked off. So we had 18 million jobs, to 12 million at the end of 2016. So that's a drop in 30%. Now, China is another story. So there's a wonderful paper study by MIT, and it's on our website, that in 1993, when NAFTA kicked off, America was only getting about 6% of its imports from China, so less than 10%. Today, we get 21% of imports from China.
Wow.
That's an increase of 262% from 1993.
That's immense.
It is a mess. Not to mention all these cargo ships.
Mm-hmm.
If you listen to our environmental video,
right,
we talk about cargo ships amount to 3% of carbon emissions, because this is really dirty fuel.
Right.
These cargo ships that are starting in the Far East and spreading out, the manufacturing base in the East to Europe and the United States and elsewhere, amount to 3% of carbon emissions. That's the same carbon footprint as the entire country of Germany. So it's,
significant.
It is significant. So now you say, what was the question again that you asked me?
What just happened to America?
I like the question. Health care. for you millennials listening and Generation Z listening at home, plutocracy democracy has advice to you regarding healthcare. Don't get sick, don't get old, and you'll be fine. Great advice. Don't get sick, don't get old. So healthcare actually has a doubling effect here on millennials and Generation Z. You get a job, employers have to pay healthcare costs for you. And their healthcare costs are going through the roof. So what does that do to employers? That prevents them from giving you more money because of their egregious healthcare costs. And it prevents them from even hiring more workers because the more workers they hire, each additional worker, they have to pay medical costs for them. So then what happens to the employee? Well, when you go to the doctor, for you or your kid or whoever, you have to pay out-of-pocket health care costs. So now I'm going to pull this up on the website. Okay. And what you're looking at now is in 1960, out-of-pocket expenses for health care amounted to roughly $13 billion. In 1970, $25 billion. Today, it is over $400 billion. So the cost of healthcare has been really shifted to the individual and to the employer. Mm-hmm. So the World War II generation model, again, what you're looking at online, they had very little out-of-pocket expenses to healthcare. Right. Today, it's egregious. We're up to $400 billion out-of-pocket healthcare expenses. Now, when you look at the national debt, what's insane is, this has been changing so drastically with these checks that they've been printing that I think we're roughly at 130% of GDP. I think Australia is at like 30% GDP with their deficit.
Right.
What that means is, put it into perspective. If you make like $100,000, in Australia, they have $30,000 of expenses. That's 30%. In the United States, you make $100,000, for example, you have $130,000 of expenses. This is what's going on in the government with these deficits.
Living outside of our means.
Yeah.
As a country.
As a country. Yeah, this is national. So you can see Australia is in much better position. In fact, there are European nations much better off than the United States. Now, what is just ironic is many of these nations have universal health care. Mm-hmm. And they're not at 130% of the GDP. We're so indebted and we don't even have universal health care.
Right.
When you just put that in perspective, that is just, it's maddening. Maddening really moving forward, Mm-hmm. So this is what has happened with healthcare. And all of this is the pinching effect, the squeezing of the middle class. So you had wages stagnated, jobs being shipped off overseas for, greed, short-termism, shareholder democracy, healthcare, employers paying out-of-pocket costs, employers paying costs for their employees, employees then having to pay out-of-pocket healthcare costs. So what just happened to America? The next thing is tuition, everybody's favorite subject.
Oh, this one hurts.
So what you're looking at today is what President Obama did as his fix for tuition. So President Obama in 2010 passed the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act, Title II, supposedly to fix the student loan crisis. What he did was that the government now profits directly from interest payments and defaults. We went from $800 billion in 2010, $800 billion, to a staggering $1.6 trillion student loan debt in 2019. So how is this possible after he passed this act? Well, he green-lighted universities to charge whatever they feel like charging because the government now has their back. You know, when you go apply for a loan, they look at your income and your debt-to-income ratio to see if you can get a loan for, say, $200,000. And most likely they will say no because they know that you can't make good on the payment. But if you want to go to a school for 4 years that will cost you $200,000, they will gladly write you that check.
At 18 with no credit.
Yeah, exactly. And because the government has their back. They know that when they give you that money, they're going to get the money from the government. And this is what President Obama did. And he's a Democrat. Give that some thought. Now, what we're going to do next is look at what just happened to America. Asset prices, home prices. So I'm going to pull up for you the Schiller report. So what you're looking at right now, you see the housing bubble 1. Housing bubble 1 crashed roughly in 2008. You are now in housing bubble 2. And you see that housing bubble 2 is still rising, much worse than housing bubble 1. So how did we get from this most recent crash in 2008 till now? Now here's a play on definitions. To some of you, when somebody mentions inflation, you think rising prices. Well, the fix for the 2008 economic collapse, you had massive deflation happening all across the globe. Of course, being Americans, we're concerned about what was happening in the United States. So deflation is somebody in 2005, 2006 bought a home for $400,000 at the top of the bubble. The economy collapses. Now, the homeowner is underwater, so the home is really valued at $250,000. That's deflation. So how did we fight this catastrophic deflation? Well, we fought this deflation with inflation. Now, the inflation that I'm using is quantitative easing. If Ben Bernanke would have came out in 2008 and said, don't worry, we're going to increase inflation, you know, the entire American populace would have went ballistic because he used the I word, inflation. So they didn't call it inflation, they called it quantitative easing. It's the same thing. So basically,
nicer.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you don't know what it is. What's quantitative easing? Well, you're inflating the money supply. That's what he did. You know, he put it on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. So the Federal Reserve balance sheet was zero, and then it quickly morphed into $4 trillion. That's quantitative easing. He inflated the money supply. You inflate a balloon. Mm-hmm. You don't inflate the price of bubble gum. You know, the price of bubble gum rises or falls, you know, but you inflate a balloon. So he inflated the money supply. Why were they doing this? Well, they were fighting catastrophic deflation, which was happening. Mm-hmm. The value of the dollar went up because as prices fall, your dollar can now buy more. So to stop this from even falling further, they fought it with inflation. They lowered interest rates to 0%. Mm-hmm. So we've had this money supply inflation from 2008 until today. So you've seen inflation in housing, you've seen inflation in the stock market. During the same period, you didn't see rising prices. So it's very important to define these terms. Otherwise, you're talking past one another. We have to agree on the terms that we're talking about. So now, because of these quantitative easing effects, we now have created a second housing bubble. Now, Graham Summers wrote a wonderful book called The Everything Bubble. That's the second book I would like to push. I don't get any money pushing these books, but it's a wonderful book by Graham Summers called The Everything Bubble, which also includes the second housing bubble, but he also talks about the 10-year Treasury notes. I don't want to go off on a tangent talking specifically about this book, but he's talking about how we are creating these asset bubbles from one asset bubble to another to another. So we went from the dot-com bubble. As that burst, what was the fix for the dot-com bubble? The housing bubble.
Right.
So as the housing bubble burst, Graham Summers points out, well, what was the fix for the housing bubble in 2008? The everything bubble. They created a bubble in U.S. Treasury notes, which is the bedrock, the centerpiece of what everything is based on. Wonderful book. Again, Peter Timmons, The Vanishing Middle Class, and Graham Summers, The Everything Bubble. Highly recommend these books. They're very short books. You don't have to be an economist to understand these books. They're written for the layperson, and you will get a very good picture as to what's going on here. So now what I want to show you is just a couple select cities in the United States. So we looked at what's happened nationally with the Schiller prices. So I just want to pull up a couple cities. So what you're looking at here is Los Angeles. So you wonder why you're seeing all these homeless people in Los Angeles. Well, look at this graph. Look at the home prices of Los Angeles. Let's pull up another one. Let's look at Portland. Here are the home prices of Portland. Here's the home prices of Seattle. Here's the home prices of Tampa. Now, I want to mention something regarding gaslighting. Hasbro produced a game called Monopoly for Millennials, and this is what you're looking at right now. In the game, it says, this is an actual game, by the way. This is not just a picture I created. This is an actual game. You can go to Walmart, buy it on Amazon, and Monopoly for Millennials. And this is gaslighting. This is what's happening to your generation. Forget real estate. You can't afford it anyway. That's on the cover of the box of Hasbro. Monopoly for Millennials. How do you feel about that? You're a millennial.
I feel pretty terrible about that. I thought that was something that you mocked up.
So you see, wages are stagnant for millennials. Home prices have risen egregiously.
Yeah.
So even though interest rates are low, it's true. You're fortunate. Than the baby boomers in the 70s that were paying 18% to buy a home.
We still can't afford houses.
But you buy these homes, you're not making the money to afford it. The only thing that we can do is keep interest rates at zero for a couple of reasons. Because you can't afford to buy anything because wages are so low, and we can't service the national debt because if we raise interest rates, the interest paid on the national debt goes up. So we can't service the national debt. So this is quite the quagmire for your generation. So what do we see from this xenomorph of neoliberalism? You know, plutocrism capitalism, our word. Right. This system that benefits the 1% of the 1% at the expense of the middle class. You are witnessing four things going on right now. And these are the four things. You're witnessing gaslighting. Okay. Gaslighting is this. Oh, you're struggling. Well, John Doe over there, he's a neurosurgeon. He seems to be doing just fine. I think there's like 1,500 neurosurgeons in the entire United States of America. You're struggling, huh? Oh, well, I guess you got the wrong degree out of college. Jane Doe over there, she got a degree in, nuclear engineering. She seems to be doing just fine. That's gaslighting. It's throwing responsibility back onto you. You see this in trials for rape. Mm-hmm. You'll see the lawyer say to the woman, so what were you wearing? As though that has any bearing to do on whether the woman was raped or not.
Right.
Yep. But it's throwing responsibility back onto the victim. Yep. That's gaslighting.
I see you got a degree in teaching. Money must not have been important to you. I'm glad you brought that up, because the very bedrock of the middle class are school teachers, mm-hmm. nurses, accountants, chemists. This system that we've created, we've casinoized Wall Street. You're almost a sucker to get a degree in teaching. Yeah.
Because, you come out, you're $30,000 to $40,000 in debt to be a school teacher. And you come out and you're making, say, $40,000 a year or whatever a school teacher makes.
I think it's less than that.
It may be, depending on where you live. The system has made it so that you're a sucker. You make me realize one of my favorite movies. There's a movie Robert De Niro did called A Bronx Tale. Being an Italian-American myself, Robert De Niro being Italian, he directed this movie, starred in this movie, A Bronx Tale. He had a child in the movie who was hanging around the local pezzinavantes, as we call them, the local big shots, the local dons, the mafioso. And Robert De Niro's kid was seeing the high life, the cars, the money, the suits, the child was being indoctrinated mm-hmm. To see that, hey, this is worth having. Where his father in the movie, played by Robert De Niro's character's name was Lorenzo, was a bus driver. Mm-hmm. And there's a very famous scene in this movie where Robert De Niro's child is a waiter for these local big shots, and they're tipping him, and they have so much money that the kid's making more money working for the local don mm-hmm. than what his dad's making as a bus driver. And there's a pivotal scene where the child says to his dad, played by Robert De Niro, he says, Sonny, who's the local don in the neighborhood, the Bronx, he goes, Sonny's right. The working man is a sucker. And Lorenzo, the dad, goes, no, you're wrong. The working man is the hero. It doesn't take anything to put a gun to somebody's head, because he's referring to mafioso, right. But to wake up every day and go to work, that's the hero. But what we've seen now from this xenomorph of neoliberalism, you're actually punished to become a school teacher, mm-hmm. a chemist, an accountant, or a nurse. You're a nurse and you have $50,000 in debt? I mean,
or more.
Or more.
These private colleges.
Exactly. So we've created a society where things are turned ass backwards. Another great movie is It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey. Everybody watches this movie over the holidays. George Bailey prays that, he wishes he would never be born. And what he sees is in his own community, because of greed and capitalism, if it runs amok, and that's really what it is, if you let capitalism run amok, his community, what is it? Gambling, alcohol, drugs, and prostitution. And he can't believe his eyes. You know, it's what's it called, Pottersville or Potterstown or something like that.
Pottersville.
Yeah. So then he begs the angel Clarence. He wants his life back. And then he's back to the Bailey's savings and loans. So you have things in checks and balances. And again, this goes back to the four models of capitalism. The World War II generation kept things in check. That's all they really did. It wasn't socialism or communism, which is what I'm about to mention with the Mott and the Bailey. All they did was rein capitalism in, whereas today's generation has let it run amok. For some reason, we've felt that true libertarianism is the best way to go. But when you look at the data doesn't show that that's the case.
Right. Which
leads me into the second thing that your generation is seeing. It's called the Mott and the Bailey fallacy. This is very important for you moving forward when you have these discussions about today's capitalism. So I'm going to give you an example. You're at a bar and somebody talks about true libertarianism, true capitalism, the manifesto of Milton Friedman, the social responsibility of corporations. What's that? The social responsibility of corporations is to maximize profits. Capitalism works best with a laissez-faire approach to business, very little, if any, government intervention, and the invisible hand will solve all of the woes of society. That's an assertion. Somebody says that at a bar. You're at a bar drinking. And then you come up to them and you say, well, you challenge that assertion. That's what you're doing. You're challenging it. You say, well, when you look at the data, the middle class is being squeezed and class mobility has been stifled. When you look at what just happened to America, when you look at wages, jobs, housing, tuition, and what did I miss? Wages, jobs, healthcare, tuition, and housing. When you look at all that, class mobility has been stifled. And that person, when you say this to somebody at a bar, they look at you, they're dumbfounded, they retreat to what's called the Mott, which is, it looks like a rook if you ever play the chess. In ancient times, this is where this expression comes from, the Mott and the Bailey, because in ancient times, when you were being confronted, you would retreat to the Mott because it was a safe haven. So this person looks at you and says, look, millennial, socialism and communism is not the answer. And nobody even mentioned socialism or communism. You're just challenging that assertion that American capitalism works best with a laissez-faire approach to business. Right. The social responsibility of a corporation is to maximize profits. You're challenging that assertion. So he hightails it up to the Mott, where nobody's even talking about socialism and communism. And as I guarantee you, as the chair of the United States Humanist Party, we concur. Socialism and communism is not the answer. What is the answer is you need reins on capitalism. You don't let it run amok. That's why the World War II model of capitalism was so stable. You know how many bank failures the World War II generation had between 1940 and 1980? Guess how many? Zero bank failures in the World War II model. Do you know how many asset bubbles the World War II generation had between 1940 and 1980? How many asset bubbles?
0.
You must be psychic. 0 asset bubbles. Since 1980 to today, these past 40 years, we've had the dot-com bubble, we've had the housing bubble, and what you are presently in, as Graham Summers so eloquently wrote in his book, you're in the everything bubble, which includes the second housing bubble. We've had catastrophic bank failures from the savings and loans in 1987, 1989, through the bank failures in the first housing bubbles, not to mention these hedge funds, the long-term capital management hedge fund. In 1998, we just had Archegos fail. So this is the new norm. So the real essence of the Mott and Bailey isn't communism, socialism. We concur. That's not the answer. So don't hightail it to the Mott. All we're saying as a political party is you need reins on capitalism to keep it from running amok. So that now says, what other thing are these plutocrats doing? Plutocracy, democracy. Well, their only other defense now, gaslighting, the Mott and Bailey fallacy, is they want to get the poor people to fight amongst themselves. So they would love nothing better to have the Proud Boys and Antifa fight it out in the streets, because MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News would be reporting on that ad nauseum, just over and over. You think it's bad that they're reporting on COVID every single second of the day. They would do nothing but report on the Proud Boys and Antifa fighting it out. The poor are fighting it out in the streets. This is a deflection, and this is precisely what plutocracy, democracy wants to happen. In fact, I don't have evidence of this, but it wouldn't surprise me that these rich plutocrats are funneling money into the Proud Boys, and they're also funneling money into Antifa, trying to get them to fight one another. Now, this goes back. You've seen this in movies. It was in the movie Gangs of New York by Martin Scorsese, Leonardo DiCaprio. It goes all the way back to Jay Gould. This is the original Baron robber back during the Gilded Age. He was into railroads, and we were going west with the railroads. They were going through farmlands, laying the railroads in eminent domain, because you have to lay the railroad, and it has to go through your land. It goes through your land. Well, Kansas farmers were up in arms over Jay Gould. And this is an actual quote by Jay Gould. He said, "I don't care about the farmers because I can hire one half of the farmers to go shoot the other half to death," because he had so much money. So this is what you see today with the Proud Boys and Antifa is, they don't care about the poor because they're trying to get half of the poor to go fight the other half of the poor. The other thing that you're seeing from these plutocrats is they're trying to deflect attention away from what they did to the immigrant situation. You have these immigrants that are crossing the Mexico-Texas border, and they're taking your jobs. That's why you're struggling. They're taking your jobs. First off, who's hiring these immigrants? If they're taking jobs, somebody has to be giving them a job.
Right.
So I seriously doubt that these immigrants who may go to a Mexican restaurant making, minimum wage, $10 or whatever the case may be, washing dishes, are the reason why the middle class is struggling. Yeah. Now I'm going to pull this picture back up that we started with, the death of the middle class. Moving forward, you have to understand that the middle class is struggling despite the fact that rich people are getting richer. The middle class is struggling despite the fact if all unemployed people got jobs and all unemployed people got off of welfare and got jobs at Burger King, McDonald's, Wendy's, Walmart, Target, they all got a job, the middle class would still be struggling.
I was going to say, I don't really see how the poor getting jobs does anything for the middle class at all.
Exactly. Because what just happened to America? Wages, jobs, health care, tuition, asset prices, specifically housing. That's what happened to the middle class. And that is the destruction of the republic. That's why we, as the United States Humanist Party, centered our party platform on the middle class. Because going back to the Constitution of the United States, the middle class is woven into the Constitution of the United States. That's why we don't have representation for poor people, middle people, rich people. You have to understand that our forefathers had access to all constitutions all the way back to the Greeks. They knew what constitutions, what type of parliaments worked and what didn't. That's why they wrote it the way that they did. Because they had, for the sake of a better word, faith in the middle people. At the time, it was land ownership, that the middle people would provide the stability of the republic. So what you're seeing as the middle class has eroded, what are you witnessing? You're seeing instability in the United States of America because the middle class has been squeezed and whittled away. And this is what our forefathers feared the most.
Well, my question would be, how do we rein that in? How do you change that?
Well, you got Democrats and Republicans, and you only have one political party. So, you really have to be delusional to think that give them 4 more years, anything is going to change. So we have to get people involved now, get millennials united,
the Republicans
to stand,
and the Democrats,
exactly,
two
to
sides
stand
of the same coin.
Exactly, stand united against plutocracy, democracy.
Oh. That was very educational. Lots of reading and following up to do.
Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for talking.
Thank you.